Let me take us to James 5. There are 3 issues in James 5. We're going to spend just a few minutes on each one. The first one really relates to the stewardship of wealth and people. Believers live a divided life. We live in a split screen. We're both guilty and declared righteous. We have both old man and a new nature. And as a result, when we actually sort of launch into looking at the problems of chapter 5, we've got to come to the conclusion that there's an awful long way for us to walk out of the world's values and into the arms of the Lord. The thing is, when we walk with the world's values, we're not walking with an understanding of what God called us to be. When we walk with heaven's values, we find it challenging not to strike back at those who take advantage of us in this life. And so what I want to do is I want to take you back to the first century, and I want you to feel what a Jewish diaspora Jew felt, a Jew in dispersion. One of the things that happens is believers can be offensive just like they can be offended. We can take advantage of people just like they can take advantage of us. So verse 1 says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments have become moth-eaten." And here's my question. Why? Why come down on people who are enjoying their life? Why should Christianity and its values be such a saddening experience? I mean, come on. But if you look more carefully, this is what he says. He says, riches that are in this life are mistimed riches. What I mean by that, verse 3. Your silver and your gold have rusted. Your rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. James remarks that they should consider a couple of things. First, most of the things of this world don't last beyond this world into the next one. So let's just be honest. He's not saying if you have a nice car now, you should go out and beat your chest and go, I can't believe it, I have a nice car, I feel so guilty. That's not the point. The point is, when you put your hope in something that's in this world, it doesn't last. The second thing is, if I tie up my resources on personal pleasures that God actually gave me to reach other people with, I will face greater judgment for my choices. I want to know this. Did God pour out as much money as he did on American Christians so that they could just live better lives? Or did he intend us to do something different in the world? Do you think that God poured out the kind of prosperity we've had because he wants us to drive nicer cars and live in bigger houses? Or could it be that he actually intended us to be the giving engine to missions around the world? Let me give a third observation. If I fail to recognize the hour is late in God's economy, I'm going to misread the calendar and feel at ease with wrong choices. If I fail to realize how late it is in the game, I'm going to feel okay about spending my money on me. But when I look at it like, you know what? With eternity's values in view, at any time Jesus could return. My neighbors are lost. What can I do to reach them? I'm going to have more parties with them invited and less parties with the same circle of friends. I'm going to do more to break out. There's something I think that's probably worth remembering. People who are drowning don't care what the rescuer is wearing. When people are drowning, they're not critiquing your clothing. They need help. We need to bear in mind that Christians that have gotten more concerned about gaining acceptance in the world are appealing to a world that has forgotten that it's running out of time. Don't worry if the world likes you. Worry if they hear your message and if you reflect it with love. If you reflect the message with love and they hate it, really, what's the alternative? Change the message so it's more palatable, except for then they're not lost? That's not going to help. The truth is, it's harder and harder. Guys, there's probably something that's happening in your life, and some of you I know have felt it through the year. We have instruction in the New Testament about how to handle sin inside the body. What are we supposed to do about that? Yeah, I was actually thinking, yes, you're thinking more mechanically. I was thinking more of the contend for the faith thing. We know that among believers, let's say, Dennis is trying to introduce something that's like, we know is sin. Among us, what we should be doing is contending that that's not right. We're not going to accept that, okay? We understand that. The problem is, outside in the world, we have a completely different set of rules. When you step outside of the body, how are you to handle people who are sinning? With absolute unconditional love. It doesn't really matter what their sin is. It could be of any variety, right? So maybe and sometimes that's hard. Somebody who abuses a child, how is it not hard to love them? I mean, come on. It's going to be very hard to unconditionally love people when they do acts that are heinous against innocence, right? I mean, I personally would like to pummel somebody who harms someone in a nursing home. Come on. What kind of sick person are you? But it's not my job to do that. My job is to reflect lovingly the truth of Jesus Christ to them. The problem is we live these split lives. We have to live one standard inside the church and one standard out in the world. Now here's the third place. There's nothing in the New Testament, nothing that tells us how to live in the public square when we have a vote. Next to something like verse 3, I would put, if you are cheating, he is watching. Your rust will be a witness against you. Is if your value system is that things in this world are so important to you that you'll cheat to get them, if you're cheating, he's watching. Just know that he knows how you're playing the cards he gave you. He does. Verse 4, the pay of the laborers who has mowed your field and has been withheld from you cries out against you. If you take advantage of other people, God sees it. Don't make any mistake about that. So the time that you withhold the money that you have promised to somebody is time that God is keeping track. And the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. That is the word for the Lord of hosts or the Lord of the armies. That is, God and his armies have borne witness of what you are doing when you have not cared for and paid for those who have made your wealth. They went out and harvested your goods and you didn't pay them. Verse 5, you have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure. By the way, we, by all definitions, live at unparalleled, pleasurable luxury. Come on. Nobody ever had a chariot as nice as yours. Nobody ever lived in, nobody in antiquity could imagine walking up to the wall, hitting a button and changing the temperature in the room. Nobody could imagine that. So he's not against, I don't want you to go home, have bread and water and sleep on a bed of nails. But the second part of that, wanton pleasure, is be careful. In all of the luxuries that are out there, you can go overboard and just spend more to spend more to spend more on yourself. I know people that the first thing that comes to their mind when they get a raise is something new they will buy themselves, not something new they will give. And I would just say this. He goes on and he says, you've led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. That's a kind of a good agricultural way of saying you've just loaded yourself up with more. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you. You have become so lopsided that you don't see justice anymore. So let's just step back and say the first part of the chapter is the ninth problem, and that is we are to see our wealth and the people of our life as a stewardship issue before God. You don't own anything. You came in with nothing, you will go out with nothing, and the things that God gives you in the interim, you get to steward them. One of my greatest concerns is as we come to the end of the year is, have I stewarded well this class? Because I really want to do better and better and better and make sure that I'm not giving you information that is less than its best. I think on the other hand, you're going out and you're going to be looking at your life and saying, am I stewarding well what God has given to me? Now, go down to verses 7 through 12, because after stewardship, he goes to patience and endurance. Take a look at this for a second. He says in verse 7, therefore be patient until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it. Do you know what he's saying? Be patient for the coming of the Lord, the way a farmer who plants and waters waits until God is done doing what he's doing. You have to recognize in your life that God is the one who's actually making things work. You can work hard, you can plant, you can water, but you don't make the cells of the plant grow. That's God's business. And then it says, being patient about it until it gets the early and the latter rains. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Do not complain. Stop right there. The Lord's nearness and the coming of the Lord, the lateness of the hour, should stop us from being people who complain. We should be thinking, at any day now, Jesus may be here. So I need to not walk around complaining. In fact, that's why verse 9 goes on and says the judge is standing right at the door. Be careful about what you're saying. You will have to hear it again. Verse 10, as an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. We count those blessed who endured. You've heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and merciful. But above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath. Stop there. Why does it sound like he rolled right from Job to swear? What's he doing here? Exactly. He said Satan wanted to draw Job in to get him to make declarations or statements concerning God. He says, slow down. Don't swear, not by heaven or by earth or any other oath, but let your yes be yes, your no, no, so that you may not fail under judgment. What I want you to do is watch your words. So he comes back again to the words problem. When I read James over and over and over, I am convinced that one of the biggest problems the early church had was mouthy Christians. It's one of the biggest problems it had. When I look at the internet, one of the biggest problems I think the 21st century church has is mouthy Christians. I think it continues to be Christians saying things that don't represent Jesus very well, but saying them loudly and rudely. And we need to be careful about that. All right, so patience and endurance. What do you take away from verses 7 through 12? I take away that knowing that the Lord is nearby helps me to monitor my words well. Knowing that I will be judged by him helps me to monitor my words well. Knowing that he is listening makes me not make fancy formulas to try and get around what I'm really saying. It helps me monitor my words well. Let's go to the last part, and we will finish out this book. The last part of it has to do with God not only orchestrates and allows challenges to come into the body of Messiah, but he includes instructions on the way we're supposed to appropriately respond to the challenge. And here, the last part of chapter 5 is about a person who's sick. Now, it doesn't start that way. It starts with some other things. Is anyone suffering? Pray. Is anyone cheerful? Sing. Is anyone sick? And that's where he's really going. He's kind of zeroed in on, is there anybody sick? And here's what he's doing. By the way, I have a view on this that's not the majority view, so I'll tell you in advance. I actually believe that the sickness in 5:13 to 20 is about sinfulness in their life. I recognize that there's a verse in here that doesn't sound like that, but I'm going to address that in a minute. Here's my issue. I think 11 issues are dealt with in the text, and 10 of them clearly are sin. This is sinful fighting, sinful release of wisdom, sinful use of the tongue, sinful use of money and people, sin. And then you get to the last one and people say, well, it's not really always about sin. I think it is. It's either the one that stands alone, or it's also about sin. Now, there's a reason why people don't think it is, and that's because if you read it carefully, it sounds like only some of it is. Let's take a look at what he says. He says, is there anybody sick? Then he must call for the elders of the church, and they are to pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. Does verse 14 stop you from going to a doctor? Does it say that it's appropriate? You know, I could make the argument. It never says the word doctor anywhere in here. It doesn't say anything about a physician, and they had physicians in the first century. So how can you prove to me, if it says go to the elders, why should I go to a doctor? I'm just going to go to the elders. If it's about sin, if it's about a spiritual issue, the reason you're calling the elders is not in place of your doctor, but because they are going to do something your doctor can't do. And that is help you deal with a spiritual issue. That's the reason I believe it is, in fact, a spiritual issue. So a man calls for the elders of the church, a woman calls for the elders of the church because there's something they've done in their life and they have resisted God they've gotten sick, and now they call on the elders of the church who come, and the oil that they will pour on them will not fix their problem. It is symbolic. Look at verse 15. And the prayer offered in faith will restore the one who is sick, and the Lord will raise him up. If he has committed sins, they will be forgiven him. So the last part of that sounds like, well, some of them maybe didn't commit sins. I think the problem is the way the verse is translated. Here's what it says. It says that there are people who are in pain, and it's possible that they've been through a setback or reversal. There are people who have a problem with their body. It's possible that they need some kind of help or counsel. But when they get the elders there, they come in and the elders do something very specific. First, notice verse 14. There's a response of the people who are sick themselves. Who calls for the elders in the verse? The person. It's not a consultation by their family. It is the person who says, I need the elders of the church. Second, there's a work of those who care for the flock, and that's the work of the elders, and so it's very clear who he calls for. Third, in a preventative way, all believers are to be instructed to stem off such illnesses. That is, we're to pray for one another, therefore confess your sins to one another, verse 16. Pray for one another so that you may be healed. In other words, you can stem off getting to that place by confessing to one another your sin and praying with one another so you never get that sick to begin with. That's what he's saying. Now, in verse 15, does he promise in verse 15 that everybody who prays, who gets prayed over by the elders will get well? You want to say no, but what does the verse say? Doesn't it look like it says yes? How many of you think the verse says yes, but I think no, and I don't know why? Okay, good. Because that's exactly right. The problem is the grammar. What he says is the prayer offered in faith. This is a very strict way of saying this. What he says is the prayer of the faith given to him. That's actually how I would translate it. The prayer of the faith, there's a definite article, given to him. It's reflexive. It's a reflexive verb. So here's what he says. He says, the elders gather around and they pray over this man. And if the prayer of the faith given to him is uttered, the person gets up. What does that mean? That means that in that room, under those conditions, having been released from their sin, having confessed it to the elders will gather around and pray. And if God grants the prayer of the faith given to the elder to speak, it will work. If he doesn't give him that prayer, the person doesn't get well. So what they're doing is the elders are gathering around and going, God, this is an opportunity. We've placed ourselves in this room for you to have an opportunity to operate within the elders to raise this person up. Now, I have been in this room many times. On some occasions, the person got well. Probably the most prominent one I know was Ralph Wiley, and this hall is named after him. And he went into the hospital with cancer throughout his body. Elders came, they anointed him with oil, they prayed over him, they took x-rays, there was no cancer. He walked out of the hospital. 50 years later, after a thriving ministry, the cancer all came back, and then he died. But he had 50 years to serve Jesus between the time he was supposed to be dead and the time he was. Now, at the end of it, it says, if he's committed sins, but I actually would have translated it, the sins which he has committed, they will be forgiven him. In other words, the sins related to the sickness, not all sins of every type. I mean, if he's got sins related to this illness, they will be forgiven him. Why? Because he confessed his faults one to another. And that's what verse 16 says. So therefore, confess your faults one to another so that you don't have to go through this. Besides that, you're going to run the elders' sandals to nothing, running around dumping oil on people. Why don't you just confess your faults one to another and get right with God and be healed? And the effective prayer of a righteous man can accomplish much. Now, here's what the end of that verse 16 says. To me, the elders coming in are coming in clean before God. And the effectiveness of the prayer is not only dependent upon God giving it to him. God giving it to him is dependent upon those men being right with God. So let me say it this way. you call the elders and you know that you're the sick person and you know you want to confess, right? But the elders now have a job. They got to get in a room, get on their knees, and get right with God. Because this isn't going to happen if they're going to screw this up if they walk in there not being right with God. That's what I think is being said here. And I think from the very beginning of the church, God used individuals to heal other individuals. He does. But ultimately, he does it through his own power, not through ours. There's nobody walking around in the church that has the healing power. There's God who has the healing power that chooses to use me today, if he chooses to.